The first cut was the coldest. Elias drove the spade into the frozen crust of the late autumn earth, and the shock of it ran up the hickory handle, through his leather gloves, and into the bones of his arms. The ground gave a grudging inch, no more. He shifted his weight, leveraged the handle, and a plate of dark soil, webbed with frost, broke free with a sound like tearing cloth. Beside him, Boro, a dog of indeterminate but sturdy lineage, watched with intelligent brown eyes. The dog's breath plumed in the air, a series of silent, white questions. Elias did not look at him. He set the first clod of earth aside, took a breath that burned his lungs, and drove the spade in again. This was his inheritance, a small, sturdy house built by his father's hands, 20 acres of unforgiving northern land, and a collection of journals filled with a dead man's careful script and improbable theories. The house stood on a slight rise, exposed to the winds that scoured Whisper Creek Valley from November to April. For 2 generations, his family had fought the cold. They had banked the foundation with earth and hay, stuffed rags into the window frames, and fed the great stone fireplace with a desperation that consumed half the summer's labor. Every winter, the cold won small victories. It burst a pipe, soured the milk in the cellar, and left a permanent, aching chill in the marrow of the inhabitants. His parents had succumbed to a lung fever 2 winters past, their graves marked by simple stones on the hill behind the house, a testament to the cold's ultimate victory. Elias was 18, and he did not intend to follow them. He dug. The trench grew slowly, a dark scar running from the slight depression in the pasture, 100 yards distant, straight toward the foundation of his home. It was 3 feet wide and would need to be 12 feet deep. Boro whined softly, a low note of concern, and nudged Elias's hand with his cold nose. Elias paused, resting his forehead against the spade's handle. He could feel the tremor of exhaustion in his muscles. "It'll work," he said, his voice a low murmur, not meant for the dog so much as for the listening quiet of the valley. The quiet did not last. Mr. Abernathy, his nearest neighbor a half-mile down the valley road, reined in his horse, his face a mask of weathered disbelief. He was a man whose knowledge of the land was written in the deep lines around his eyes, a practical man who trusted only what he had seen work for 50 winters. And he had never seen this. "Elias," he called out, his voice raspy with the cold air. "What in God's name are you doing, boy?" Elias straightened, pulling the spade from the earth. He nodded a greeting. "Mr. Abernathy, you're digging a ditch. In November. Are you planning to bury yourself before the ground freezes solid?" The question was not unkind, but it was heavy with the weight of conventional wisdom. "A tunnel," Elias corrected quietly. Abernathy squinted, as if the word itself were foreign. "A tunnel? To where? The devil's parlor?" "To the house. For heat." The old man let out a short, sharp laugh that was swallowed by the vast, cold air. "Heat? From a hole in the ground? Son, the ground freezes 5 feet deep here, sometimes more. Whatever foolishness you've got in your head, it won't stop the frost. You need to be chopping wood, not digging your own grave." He gestured with a gloved hand toward the thin plume of smoke rising from his own chimney, a distant signal of sense and preparation. "That's how you fight the winter." Elias looked at the dark line of the trench, then back at the old farmer. "I have a plan." "A plan," Abernathy repeated, shaking his head. He looked at Boro, who sat loyally by the trench, as if seeking an ally in sanity. The dog just blinked. "Your father was a good man, Elias, but he had strange ideas. Looks like you've inherited them. Don't let them be the death of you. Wait until the first real freeze. You'll see." He clucked to his horse, the sound sharp and final, and rode away, leaving Elias alone with the wind and the growing trench. The plan was not his own. It was his father's, discovered on page 17 of the third journal. His father, a man who had read books on engineering from faraway lands, had become obsessed with the ancient Persian qanats, underground channels that brought water from aquifers to arid lands. But he saw a different potential. The Earth, he had written, was a great battery. Below the frost line, its temperature remained a constant, steady 50 or 55 degrees. A vast, gentle warmth, useless if you couldn't bring it to the surface. His theory was simple, elegant, and, to the people of Whisper Creek Valley, utterly mad. Dig a long, gently sloped tunnel deep beneath the frost line. Sink a series of vertical shafts along its length. The colder, denser air of winter would fall into the highest shaft, push through the deep tunnel, and be warmed by the constant temperature of the deep earth. This geothermally warmed air, now lighter, would rise through a final shaft connected to the house's foundation, creating a slow, constant, passive circulation of air that was not warm, but was, crucially, not freezing. It was a system that required no fire, no fuel, only an immense, almost unthinkable amount of labor. It was a madman's poetry written in earth and stone. Elias believed every word. He spent his evenings by lamplight, studying his father's precise diagrams, his calculations of airflow and thermal exchange. By day, he dug. The topsoil gave way to dense clay, then to a layer of stone and gravel that fought him for every inch. His hands, already calloused from farm work, blistered, broke open, and bled. He tended to them at night, soaking them in salt water, wrapping them in clean linen. Boro would lick the bandages, a silent, comforting ritual. Weeks passed, the trench deepened. He began the slow, arduous work of tunneling, shoring up the earth above him with timbers he cut and shaped himself. He worked by the light of a lantern, his world reduced to a small, moving circle of damp earth, the scent of clay, and the rhythmic scrape and thud of his tools. He lost track of time, measuring his progress not in days, but in feet. 5 feet. 10. 20. The work was a meditation. It was a prayer. It was an argument against the wind that howled above. When he went to town for supplies, he felt the eyes on him. At Gable's general store, the talk would quiet when he entered. Mr. Gable, a man whose wealth was built on selling the necessities of survival, looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Still digging that big hole, son?" Gable asked one afternoon, weighing out a sack of flour. "Still digging," Elias confirmed. "Abernathy says you think you're going to pull heat out of the ground. That's the craziest thing I've ever heard." He shook his head, a gesture that invited the other men gathered around the pot-bellied stove to join in his derision. "The only thing in that ground is rocks and worms, and soon, frost. You'll be begging for firewood come January. I'll have some to sell you, at a premium, of course, for those who don't plan ahead." Elias paid his $17 for the supplies, his face impassive. He did not argue. He did not explain. His father's journal had a line he'd underlined twice. "Let the work be the only argument." He loaded his wagon and headed back to the trench, the laughter from the store following him for a few moments before being lost to the wind. Not everyone looked at him with scorn. Lena, the postmistress, who also served as the town's unofficial librarian, would sometimes walk out to his property on her delivery route, even when there was no mail. She would stand at the edge of the deepening scar, her expression one of genuine curiosity. She was quiet like him, observant. "It's for a geothermal exchange, isn't it?" she asked one day, her breath misting. She held a book in her mittened hands. Elias stopped, surprised she knew the term. Something like that. I read about it, in a book on Roman engineering. They used a similar principle for cooling, the hypocaust. She looked from the trench to his face, her eyes clear and direct. They thought it was ingenious. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. For the first time, someone was looking at his work not as madness, but as a continuation of history. My father read those books. He was a smart man, she said simply. She offered him the book she was holding. It was a collection of essays on agricultural science. I thought you might like this, for the evenings. Thank you, he said, taking it. Their fingers brushed. The small contact felt more significant than it should have. She nodded, a small smile on her face. Keep digging, Elias. I think you're onto something. Her belief was a small, steady flame against the encroaching cold of the valley's doubt. He worked with renewed purpose. By the time the first snows came, dusting the valley in a thin blanket of white, the main tunnel was complete. 300 feet of it, a dark, perfectly sloped tube running 12 feet below the surface. He had lined the unstable sections with field stones, fitting them together with the patience of a stonemason, a skill his father had taught him. Now came the shafts. He dug the first one at the far end of the tunnel, the air intake. It was a simple vertical hole, 4 feet in diameter, that he lined with stone to prevent its collapse. He fashioned a slatted wooden cover to keep out snow and animals. Then he began the second, and the third, and the fourth, spaced 50 feet apart along the tunnel's length. These were smaller, just for maintenance and to promote airflow, according to his father's notes. The final shaft, the one that would connect to the house, was the most difficult. He had to dig down from the outside, right against the stone foundation, and then carefully break through into the cellar. The day he broke through was a milestone. He chiseled away the last of the mortar and stone, and a puff of cool, damp, earthy-smelling air breathed into the cellar. It was the first breath of his creation. Burro, who had been watching from the cellar stairs, padded over and sniffed at the opening, his tail giving a single, hopeful thump against the dirt floor. Elias knelt, placing his hand in the airflow. It was 52 degrees. Outside, the air was a sharp 28 and falling. He worked to seal the connection, building a sturdy, stone-lined duct that fed from the shaft into a distribution channel he'd built beneath the floorboards of the main room. He'd raised the floor by 6 inches, creating a plenum, and installed a series of small, grated vents around the perimeter of the room. This was the final piece of the design. The warmed air would rise into the plenum and seep gently into the living space through the vents, while the colder house air would be drawn down into the cellar and eventually out through the chimney flue, creating a slow, constant circular flow. He finished the last vent on the day Abernathy's prediction came true. The world went still. The sky turned a hard, brilliant, unforgiving blue. The temperature plummeted. It was a freeze unlike any he had ever experienced. The old-timers called it a still cold, a dry, deep, invasive chill that found every crack and stole every ounce of warmth. The snow squeaked under his boots with a sound like crying. The trees cracked and popped in the woods, their sap freezing and expanding. Inside the general store, the men huddled closer to the stove, which roared with a desperate hunger. "-10 this morning," Gable announced, his voice grim. "And the wind is supposed to pick up tonight. God help anyone whose woodpile is short." His eyes fell on Elias, who was buying coffee and salt. "How's that dirt-warmed house of yours holding up, boy? Got icicles on the inside of your windows yet?" "It's fine," Elias said. "It's fine," Gable mocked, though with less humor than before. The depth of the cold had put a nervous edge on his voice. "We'll see how fine it is tomorrow, or the day after. This isn't a one-night chill. The almanac says this could last a week." Elias returned home. He sealed the house, lit a single lamp, and sat in his father's chair. Boro lay at his feet, his head on his paws. Outside, the wind began to rise, a low moan that grew into a piercing shriek. It rattled the window panes and hammered at the walls. This was the test. Everything, the months of back-breaking labor, the ridicule, his father's legacy, came down to this night. He did not build a fire. That was the point. The great stone fireplace, for the first time in the house's history, remained cold and dark. He walked to the nearest vent in the floor and knelt, placing his palm over the grate. A gentle, almost imperceptible current of air flowed out. It wasn't warm, not like air from a furnace. It was just not cold. He checked the thermometer on the wall. Outside, it was now -15 degrees. Inside the house, it was 58. He sat by the window, watching the snow begin to whip and swirl, driven by the furious wind. The glass was cool to the touch, but there was no frost on it, not a single crystal. Boro, who usually shivered and pressed against him on cold nights, was sleeping soundly, breathing the deep, even breaths of a comfortable dog. A profound sense of quiet victory settled over Elias. He made coffee on the cook stove, the only heat source he used, and the small warmth it generated was enough to lift the room to a comfortable 62 degrees. He opened the book Lena had given him. He read about crop rotation and soil health as the worst storm in a decade raged outside, trying to tear his house from its foundation. The house held, and it was not cold. The storm lasted for 4 days. The temperature never rose above 0. The wind never stopped. On the third morning, there was a frantic pounding at his door. Elias opened it to a figure crusted in snow, his face raw with cold. It was Mr. Abernathy.
"Elias,"
the old man stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably.
"My pipes, they burst. The well froze solid. My fire, I can't keep it going fast enough. My wife, it's so cold. Can we—"
He couldn't finish the sentence. He just looked past Elias into the calm, quiet warmth of the house, his eyes wide with an astonishment that eclipsed his desperation. There was no fire roaring in the hearth. There was no sign of a struggle against the cold. There was just peace. "Come in," Elias said simply. "Bring her over." Abernathy stumbled inside, Boro rising to greet him with a curious sniff. The old man unwrapped the scarf from his face and just stood there, feeling the air. He held his hands out, as if expecting to find a stove, but there was nothing. The warmth was just there, in the room, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once.
"How?"
Abernathy whispered, his voice full of awe.
"There's no fire."
"The tunnel," Elias said. He led the old man to one of the floor vents. Abernathy knelt, his joints cracking, and put a trembling hand over the grate. He felt the slow, steady breath of the earth. He looked up at Elias, and the skepticism that had lived in his eyes for months was gone, replaced by a deep and profound respect.
"You did it,"
he breathed.
"The boy actually did it."
Within the hour, he returned with his wife, bundled in every blanket they owned. Elias settled them in the main room, gave them hot coffee and stew. Mrs. Abernathy, her face pale and pinched, began to cry with relief as the feeling returned to her fingers and toes. They were not the last. Later that day, the Gables arrived. Their grand house, the largest in the valley, had 3 fireplaces, but they couldn't keep the cold at bay. The pipes in their walls had frozen and burst, flooding the kitchen with a layer of ice. Their vast stockpile of firewood was no match for the predatory chill. Mr. Gable, a man accustomed to being in charge, looked humbled and lost. His wife's face was a mask of fear.
"Elias,"
he said, his voice stripped of its usual bluster.
"We saw Abernathy's horse. We need shelter, just until it breaks."
He looked around the room, at the Abernathys sitting calmly by the window, at the quiet dog, at the impossible lack of a fire. His gaze met Elias's.
"We were wrong,"
he said, the words costing him a visible effort.
"What you've done here, it's—"
He couldn't find the word. "Come in," Elias said, stepping aside. His small house became an ark. By nightfall, 3 other families had joined them, their own homes rendered uninhabitable by the unprecedented cold. The house was crowded, but it was safe. It was full of the quiet hum of conversation, the smell of coffee, and the shared warmth of survival. Elias moved among them, a quiet host, ensuring everyone had blankets and food. Lena arrived on the 4th day, having checked on everyone in the village. She brought the last of the bread from the bakery. Her own small apartment behind the post office was frigid. When she stepped into Elias's house, she smiled, a slow, radiant smile of vindication. "I knew it," she whispered to him. "I knew it would work." When the freeze finally broke on the 5th day, the sun seemed like a stranger in the sky. The temperature climbed to a balmy 20 degrees. The families returned to their damaged homes to assess the cost of the storm. The valley was a wreck. Dozens of homes had burst pipes. Livestock had frozen in barns. The winter's supply of preserved goods in many cellars was ruined. The cost was immense. Only one house had survived without a scratch. The way the valley looked at Elias changed overnight. He was no longer the crazy orphan digging a pointless hole. He was the one who had listened to the earth. He was the one who had been right. The transformation began with Mr. Abernathy. He came to Elias a week later, hat in hand. "Elias," he said, his voice formal, "I want to apologize
for doubting you, for laughing at you."
"No need," Elias said.
"There is a need," Abernathy insisted. "You saved me and my wife. What you built. I want to learn. Will you teach me?"
Elias nodded. He took out his father's journals, the pages worn and soft as cloth, and spread them on the table. He explained the principles, the slope, the depth, the physics of the slow-moving air. Abernathy, the man of 50 winters' experience, listened with the rapt attention of a student. That spring, a second trench was started in Whisper Creek Valley. It was on Abernathy's land. Elias was there to help, to advise, to show the old farmer how to read the soil and brace the tunnel walls. Soon, Gable came too. He offered to pay Elias, but Elias refused. "My father wanted this knowledge shared," he said. Gable, humbled, took up a shovel. Other men joined them. The work of digging, once a solitary act of faith for Elias, became a communal effort. They worked together, hauling rock, cutting timbers, sharing lunches and stories as they scarred the valley with trenches of hope. They were no longer just digging tunnels. They were building a future. 5 winters passed. 10 new tunnels now breathed the earth's gentle warmth into the homes of Whisper Creek Valley. The great freeze of that first year was spoken of as a turning point, the disaster that had saved them. The houses were no longer cold, damp prisons. The winter was no longer a mortal enemy to be fought with the endless, exhausting labor of the axe. The valley prospered. People had more time, more energy. They could mend tools, raise better livestock, read books by the fireless warmth of their homes. Elias and Lena married in the small valley church. Their life was quiet and full. They built their own furniture, grew their own food, and raised 2 children in the small house that had once been an object of ridicule and was now a place of pilgrimage. The valley's transformation was Elias's quiet legacy. He never sought praise. He spoke little, as always, but when he did, people listened. He taught them how to work with the land, not against it. He showed them how to observe the subtle shifts in the wind, the behavior of the animals, the language of the earth his father had first deciphered. He became the new elder, the source of unconventional wisdom that had proven itself superior to conventional doubt. Boro grew old. His muzzle turned gray, his steps became slow and deliberate. He spent his days sleeping in the patches of sunlight that fell on the floor, or lying with his head near one of the warm air vents. One spring morning, when the snow had melted and the first crocuses were pushing through the soil, he did not wake up. He had died peacefully in his sleep, in the warm, safe house he had watched Elias build. Elias carried his old friend in his arms, the body still and light, and buried him on the hill, near the intake shaft of the great tunnel, the place where the system began its first breath. He carved a simple stone for him, Boro, a faithful witness. He stood there for a long time, his hand on the cool stone, remembering the worried whines and the hopeful thumps of the tail that had accompanied every foot of the tunnel's creation. Lena came and stood beside him, taking his hand. They did not speak. There was no need. Years turned into decades. The children grew up and had children of their own. The tunnels became an unremarkable feature of every home in the valley, their construction passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter. The journals of Elias's father were copied and shared, their pages memorized. Elias's hair turned the color of snow. His hands, which had dug the first trench, became knotted with age, but they were never idle. He taught his grandchildren how to read the sky and how to listen to the quiet murmur of the air rising from the earth. He lived to be 87 years old. He died, as his parents had not, peacefully in his own bed, in the gentle, fireless warmth of the house he had willed into being. The entire valley came to his funeral. They buried him on the hill, next to his parents, and beside his faithful dog. They did not mourn his death so much as they celebrated his life, a life of quiet persistence and profound vision. Mr. Abernathy's grandson, now a master stonemason, carved the headstone. He worked for a month, choosing the finest piece of granite from the local quarry. He did not carve dates of birth or death. He carved the epitaph the entire community had agreed upon, the words that summed up the legacy of the quiet boy who had once dug a hole no one understood. The stone stood against the harsh blue sky, overlooking the valley that now thrived in the harshest winters, its homes all breathing with the gentle, constant warmth of the earth. It read, "Elias, he taught us to listen." Long after he was gone, on the coldest nights of the year, when the wind howled and the trees cracked with frost, the people of Whisper Creek Valley would sit in their homes, feeling the mild air rise from the floor. They would look at their children, sleeping soundly without the shiver of cold, and they would remember the story. They would tell of the orphan boy and his dog, of the long trench, of the town's mockery, and of the great freeze that changed everything. And they would understand that the greatest warmth did not come from a fire, but from the courage to believe in a plan, the strength to endure the doubt, and the quiet wisdom to trust the ground beneath their feet. The house stood, a monument not of stone and wood, but of an idea, and it was never cold again.